Some of the world's fiercest warriors, from Spartans and samurais to Vikings and English knights, prided themselves on fearlessness. But if we survey the lives of our most pious figures, they seem frequently to be filled with fear, to the point that God himself repeatedly needs to interfere. When Elijah is forced to censure a Jewish king for his idolatry, God tells him, Al Tira, do not fear. When Gideon comes face to face with an angel, God tells him, Al Tira, do not fear. 3 times when Joshua prepares to fight against the city of Ai and a band of Canaanites, and then 5 Amorite kings, God tells him, Al Tira, do not fear. Even Moses, our supreme prophet, seems uneasy in the company of a giant enemy when God tells him, Al Tira, do not fear. And the same pattern of apparent apprehension brought to our attention through a reassurance given by heaven can be traced to the dawn of Jewish time. Halfway down to Egypt, to embrace his long-lost son, Jacob prays and seems to waver in the face of his adventure when God tells him, Al Tira, do not fear. And after fleeing the Philistines and revitalizing his father's wells, Isaac lies sleepless at night when God tells him, Al Tira, do not fear. But it is our first founding father, the man who we meet properly this week, who appears to be only the second human being after Adam to feel fear, having waged war and won, and rescued his nephew from a violent alliance of belligerent kings. Abraham greets a priest called Melchizedek, rejects an offer from the monarch of Sodom, and then receives a vision from on high, accompanied with the 2 words that we've seen repeated through the course of time, Al Tira, do not fear. And of course, a number of commentators suggest, in Omrim Al Tira, there is no need to say, do not fear, Ela Lamit Yareh, unless the listener is afraid, which leads us to our question. Why was Abraham afraid? The war had been won. His nephew had been rescued. His enemies had been defeated. His allies had his back. Now was the time for relief, if not outright jubilation. Why was he so fearful? Why was he so frightened? Why was he so terrified? Why was he so afraid that God himself needed to say, Al Tira, do not fear? And there are a whole series of attempts to address this question. For Rashi, Avram was afraid in the wake of a miraculous military victory that his reward in heaven had just been spent. In his words, Avram thought that his just deserts had been exhausted, thinking, Shema kibalti sachar al kol sidkotai, maybe I've just received all the reward for all my piety. So for Rashi, Avram feared that fate had robbed him of the long-awaited prize for a lifetime of piety, that a single military victory had come at the cost of his eternity. But for Nachmanides and the Chizkuni, Avram did not fear the loss of spiritual compensation, but the very real possibility of military retaliation. He was not afraid of eternity in an empty heaven, but a protracted battle here on earth, where the heirs or the friends of his defeated enemies might seek revenge and refuse to bring an end to hostilities or transcend the past. And for Gersonides, a third reading of Avram's anxiety is that he feared not the loss of heavenly compensation, nor did he anticipate retribution or retaliation. He feared that his associations with Sodom might inflict irreversible damage on his reputation for hospitality, generosity, and care. We cannot always pick our allies in war, as our focus is on our just mission more than appearing pure, and Avram feared that fighting shoulder to shoulder with Sodom would stain his good name. But there is one more reading of Avram's fear, one more explanation of why here he appears so solemn and sober in the wake of winning a war and saving his kin. Reb Levi of the Midrash says Avram's fear was simple. He was not afraid of losing compensation. He was not afraid of any further confrontation, and he was not afraid of tarnishing his reputation. He was afraid, quite simply, that war might have deformed his soul As one commentator later elaborates, Avram's brain was ablaze with a series of searing questions, knowing that the capture of his brother's son had left him no choice but to fight and find and defend his family. The realities of war, in retrospect, vexed his soul and occupied his mind. He knew that we need to fight evil. Aval, but he thought to himself, Shema nehereg al yadenu tzadik echad. What if one righteous soul died in the crossfire? Shema nehereg yereh shamayim echad. What if one pious soul had died in the crossfire? So Avram's fear for this sage and commentator was focused not on his metaphysical or physical or political condition, but on the viability of our moral vision in the context of conflict. As I noted in the name of John Stuart Will 2 weeks ago, war is an ugly thing, but it is more than that too. War, for the stewards and wardens of Jewish thought, is an aberration. It is abnormal. So while the leaders of Greece and Persia and Egypt and Rome all believed that power was an ends and that war was innate in nature, that conflict is a permanent and eternal state, our prophets dreamed of peace. Walter Kaufmann, a renowned 20th century historian, was a German who converted to Judaism only to discover that his grandparents were Jewish, and speaking of Micah and his peers, he wrote, "It is hard to do justice to the originality of men who in the 8th century BCE insisted that war is evil. War, for our sages, is so abnormal that it distorts our laws. Ordinarily, the single most important value in Jewish thought is human life. Our tradition insists that if there is even an infinitesimal possibility of lethal danger, Shabbat is suspended, kashrut is suspended, prayer is suspended, almost every single religious obligation is suspended. The only time that we stand still in the face of danger is when the alternative involves committing adultery, idolatry, or murder. Our tradition insists that there is no price that can be set for any single human life, and that its protection is among the most prized duties of our creed. And yet, in the words of Rav Asher Weiss, Dinei Milchama Shani, the laws of war are different. Soldiers go to the front knowing that they may die. Military tacticians strategize, knowing full well that some of their ranks will lose their lives. And of course, it is understood that non-combatants will often get caught in the crossfire. We as human beings are yet to find a way to win a war without performing this dehumanizing computation where we think of lives on all sides as expendable for the greater good. War, by necessity, distorts our norms. As Rav Yosef Babad, the Minchat Chinuch, puts it, Nehi, it is true, Dechol ha-mitzvot nidachim mipnei ha-sakana, that every religious mandate is suspended in the face of danger. Mikol makom, but mitzvah lilchom, there is a mandate to fight wars. Af al pi shebederech ha'olam, even though we all know neragid mishnei tzadim, that people die on both sides. V'tzarich iyun, and this requires contemplation. And though the phrase tzarich iyun colloquially means that the legal matter remains unresolved or disconcerting, perhaps here we can see it simply as an invitation to literally contemplate the reality. In war, we are forced to ignore the cries of human beings who do not deserve to die. We are forced to treat human lives in ways that grate against the truths that we strive to teach. We are forced to stifle our conventional conscience in favor of the exceptional, anomalous, aberrant, and abnormal laws of war, laws that are so abnormal that our sages, despite the usual scope and scale of their analyses and legislation, refused to dedicate a tractate or even a passage to its practice. As again Rav Asher Weiss says, halachotzu, these laws, lo matzinu b'divrei hagemara v'haposkim, are not discussed in the Talmud or its commentators, and we are forced, in his words, to go back to the Bible, the Tanakh, u'mefarshav. Of course, this is not unique to Jewish law. All across the Western world, the laws of war permit civil rights and civic norms to be suspended, but it does leave an open question. Will this suspension loosen our conviction that every life is precious and that war is not normal but an exception? Will our just bid for an essential victory strip us of our commitments to heaven and humanity? This, for Reb Levi, is what Avram feared, what is sometimes called a Pyrrhic victory, a kind of victory that, in the words of the Greek military leader Pyrrhus of Epirus, undoes the victor. It is impossible to kill or be willing to die without suppressing or suspending or intentionally forgetting the inestimable value of every human life, and it is wise to wonder whether the human mind can tolerate such uncharacteristic machinations without mutilating our moral vision. So Avram wonders, to use Rabbi Sachs's formulation, how to defend our bodies without endangering our souls. Read this way, Avram knew that in every war we fight on two fronts. We fight on the one hand to win, and on the other hand for the ascendance of a vision that abhors war. That is why Rabbi Soloveitchik says that in Jewish thought all wars are defensive. That is why our brothers and sisters on the front lines serve in an army called the IDF, the Israel Defense Force. Our calling since Sinai is to protect and defend human life, not to take it. And Avram wonders whether the compromises required in war had dimmed his vision, whether he had saved his brother's son, but in the process lost his soul. There can be no doubt that our current cause is righteous. There can be no doubt that this war is righteous, and there can be no doubt, for the sake of our safety and for the sake of humanity, that we need to win this war. And there can also be no doubt that part of our enemy's malicious aim is to cloud our senses and impair our vision. They recorded their barbarity to stoke our passion. They tormented our family to incite our anger. They taunt us and jeer at us. They goad us and sneer at us. They cynically and sadistically use our own suffering against us, accusing us of genocide and ethnic cleansing. They want to do more than harm our bodies. They want to destroy our souls, and we must not let them. When King David, perhaps the greatest warrior in a long list of our brave and courageous heroes, gave us the words that we say to this day. He wrote, Hashem yishmarcha mikol ra. May God protect you from all evil. Yishmar et nafshecha. May he protect your soul. And in the words of Abraham ibn Ezra, this is a prayer for protection from all evil, michutz umifnim, from the evil that threatens our bodies and the evil that threatens our souls. So as we pray for victory and support our brothers and sisters, let us aim not only for the annihilation of evil, but for the triumph of good, not only for the safety of our physical condition, but for the fulfillment of our moral vision, where our children and their children will see war for the horror that it is, live in a future without fear, and dream, as our prophets once did, of real peace. Shavua Tov.